I think we recognize as teachers that you can feel in a room more or less when people are paying attention and when they aren't. And I know for myself that I speak better when people are listening, and also I think people listen better when other people are listening as well. So we're social animals, so we don't want to think that attention is simply a property of the individual, but it's actually a property of the group as well. And I mean, the big questions that arise around what do we do about devices in the classroom, which nobody has any final answers to, and maybe there may never be one single answer to that, right? Because of course they can be very useful, and they can be very distracting. And I know from talking with students for years that some students think it's their right to do whatever they want in the classroom, right? That must be universal, right? Not just in the United States, and in Norway as well. Yeah. And other students actually resent it when they see somebody who is playing a game or on Facebook or Instagram, because it distracts them. It makes it harder for them to pay attention if they see a student in front of them who's doing something that isn't related to the course. But the thing that I think that a lot of people don't understand, and the students don't understand, is that when you are listening, or let's say when you are present, because sometimes there are other ways to be fully engaged in the classroom than just listening. You may be speaking, you may be engaging with other people, but when you are more engaged in the classroom, you are actually not only contributing to your own learning, but you're actually contributing to everybody else's learning in subtle ways that maybe someday the neuroscience will actually understand that. But I think people don't understand that. If you actually care about the quality, another thing that I will say to it, in the classrooms where I allow people to use their devices, I will say, look, if you're here, presumably you want me to be a good teacher. Well, I'm a better teacher when you are more present here. In fact, I know for a fact that if I see a classroom filled with people doing whatever they want, that it's very hard for me to be as fully present as I need to be. We all know the experience when you're with a friend, right? You're with a friend and suddenly a friend is not paying attention to you, or they're actually on their device, versus the time when somebody is actually really, they clearly want to be engaged with you. So I think that's as true in the classroom, and I've never heard anybody else say that attention is co-constructed, that it's a social construct as much as it's an individual psychological one.
And it's true, you get attention. I mean, some of the people in the audience, when you're talking to a group, they give you power, or
that's right, they do.
They give you energy.
You can feel it.
So you have to focus on these participants. And looking at somebody who is fiddling with their mobile phone, obviously not paying any attention, it sort of makes you insecure as a teacher.
That's
as
right.
well, I think.
That's right.
But what do you think about this talk about attention span? Because when you're talking about how long can you keep somebody's attention,
yes,
there are discussions from like 3 to 5 minutes when they're talking about videos, and then you can have a much longer span. So have you thought about that?
Well, I have not. I don't know the research on that right now. And in fact, we have this story that says our attention span is getting shorter, right? I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I think we have to be careful about just going along with what's being said. So I don't know anything concrete about attention span, but what I do know, both from my own work and from the research as well, is that we can strengthen our attention. I mean, that's the really good news. I mean, mindfulness practices are just an example of that. The way I sometimes will talk about it is, you go to the gym to work out and you do, reps is the term that gets used in English, repetitions and the simple exercise of mindfully bringing your attention back to the breath, or as I was talking about today, bringing your attention back to email, is actually a very effective way to strengthen one's attention. And the funny thing is that even multitasking, when done in an intentional and mindful way, can actually be the successful deployment of one's attention.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I mean, it's part of what we do in one of the last of the 4 exercises that we do in the classroom, and exercise 4 in the book goes as follows. We've been spending a lot of time in the course looking at what I call triggers. Triggers are those either internal or external events that call to our attention. You know, it could be hearing a car drive by, or hearing a conversation happening outside the classroom. It can also be a strong emotion coming up, suddenly feeling fear or anxiety or boredom or something like that, or even a thought. You know, the thought happens so often from people. Oh, I forgot to put something on my to-do list, right? You know, so those are all triggers that lead our attention away from whatever we were doing. So a lot of what my teaching is about is the possibility of noticing those triggers, and then when you notice those pause and notice those triggers, it gives you choice, because you can say, well, should I write this thing down on my to-do list right now, or should I continue to do what I'm doing at the moment, right? The answer as to which one of those things you should do will presumably depend on the context you're in the moment, and on what your current intentions are, right? So multitasking, the way I think of it, multitasking is really about making moment-to-moment choices about where your attention should go, which is actually something we're doing all the time. So from a very broad definition, where there is a sense in which we're multitasking all the time, although that's not literally what people often mean when they say we shouldn't multitask. But the more that you can actually notice a trigger and then make an intentional choice, then you are actually using your attention in a successful way, right? So you could be, I mean, there are times when perhaps we need to do more than one thing at the time. You know, you're cooking and you're taking care of the baby or something like that. And in fact, it's often commented that women seem to, in many cultures, seem to having so many needs and taking care of the home are often, you know, multitasking. So multitasking in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But if you can do it mindfully in the way that I'm talking about, which is notice the trigger and then make a conscious choice about what to do, then in fact you are using your attention in a highly refined and successful way. You're being attentive. As a side note, I would say that very often when people say multitasking is bad, that they're referring to this kind of almost mindless way that, you know, all these things are happening and I'm just, every time a trigger comes along, I'm switching, and you're not actually being very intentional about it. But what I would add to that even is that my students will sometimes say to me that they have 2 different modes in which they multitask, or don't. One is when they're really trying to get something done, like they're trying to get some schoolwork done. The other is sometimes students say that I multitask to relax. I'm just sort of watching something on YouTube, and maybe I'm listening to some music, and maybe I'm texting with a friend. Well, you can ask whether or not that's an effective thing to be doing or not. But in the spirit of the kind of coaching that I offer people, I say, you decide whether or not that's a successful thing. I mean, somebody came up to me after my lecture today and said, well, but what about the amount of screen time that we're all, you know, isn't there potentially a problem with the amount of screen time? And the research basically says yes. But that doesn't mean that in any one given moment that will tell you whether or not you should stay on your screen or not. See, that's the philosophy that underlies this work that I'm doing, which is that I think, I mean, in fact, I didn't say it quite this way in my lecture today, although maybe I'll say it tomorrow. All of this work is about achieving a degree of agency. It's you, as a student, as a teacher, as a professional person, having the skill, the awareness to say, what do I need to do now, given the current context and the current intentions? And that's why general rules will probably never be the right answer. We want to raise thoughtful, engaged observant people. And so how people use the technologies and observe them and work with them, I think is actually a very good way to teach more about autonomy and agency.
Because I've been trying to look into this. I can see it's a problem in high school sometimes with students who don't pay attention and they're falling behind in their subjects.
Right.
And I'm trying to talk to them, and I don't want to use this approach where like put away your emails, your phones, your computer, and all this.
Right.
So I'm looking for a way to make them understand in the kind of dialogue that you suggest.
Yes.
Like make them make their decisions. So
Yes.
what I'm really curious about is what kind of questions could I use as a teacher to get this kind of reflection going within the students?
That's a wonderful question, and I just want to appreciate the question, partly because I don't have a good answer, but I admit that I don't have a good answer. But you see, so before I try to give you a more specific answer, let me tell you why I'm not sure. I mean, this form of teaching that I've been developing and that I'm talking about and writing about, I'm largely doing it with people who want to do it, right? So I'm crafting this work for people. For example, the course that I teach, where I created a lot of these exercises, is a course that is not a required course. It's an elective in the information school at the University of Washington. And I interview every student before I admit them into the class. I want them to know that it's out of the box. I want them to know that they're going to be doing forms of meditation. And I also want them to know that it's going to require a great deal out of them, right? It's not me standing there lecturing. They are going to have to make the discoveries, right? So all I so far know how to do is to do it with people who are in effect coming to me and saying, I recognize that there are things I could learn and want to learn about this. So what I'm looking for, to be honest, I mean, here's my meta answer, Inger, is I would love to have partners, people who are in the world like what you're talking about, who are actually trying to figure out how to do it for the 15-year-old boy or something who doesn't want to be there, or doesn't think any of this is important, and is completely non-reflective, right? So I don't know how to do that. But I think that it's a great question to begin to sort of work on. I mean, let me turn it over to you. Give me. Maybe you could.
Yeah.
Why can you drop a seed or an idea into this conversation that we could play with?
I've been working with my French students, and I've tried to make them tell me what they want to learn instead of me telling them what to learn.
Right.
When it comes to different topics, and I think it's the same approach that I can use when it comes to this thing with multitasking. Instead of telling them to use their mobile homes or like shut off with the internet, or teachers do things like that. I want a different approach where So do I. But I think the way in is through good questions, questioning that will make them think about what they do and the consequences. And I think that you sort of gave a sense of a direction to this way of approach today, when you used practical examples, but you also use these reflective questions. Right. So I think questioning is one way in.
So I have another idea.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, I think I'd love to know, if you're going to go forward with some of this, what those questions are. But I've done one other kind of experiment. And so here's another idea that I've actually tried, and I write about it a little bit just in the last chapter of Mindful Tech. I've once so far in a course, a required course, right? I did an experiment in the classroom over 3 different class sessions. And I explained all of this in advance to the students, and I said, each of the next 3 classes we're going to have a different policy regarding the use of devices. And I don't remember which order I did it in, but in one there were no devices. In another it was a kind of moderate use of devices where basically you could have your laptop, but you couldn't have your phone. And then the last one was you could have anything you wanted, and I actually encouraged people to just kind of go wild and do anything they wanted. And at the end of each of these class sessions, I created a questionnaire, an online questionnaire, where I asked them a series of questions like, did you, what was the learning like for you? What was your experience of the learning? Were you bothered by other people? Those the kinds of questions that you might imagine asking. And then at the end of these three, and at the end of the three sessions, I asked everybody in the class to vote on which of the three strategies they preferred. Right now, I'll just tell you what the results were. I think they were not necessarily generalizable, but there was this class of about 40 students. Okay. I was really surprised. The majority of the students wanted no devices. And by the way, this was a master's class, and students were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Okay, the majority of the students, not a large majority, but the majority wanted no devices in the classroom, none. But a number of them, because I also asked them to write comments, some of them actually said, "But I don't want to deprive other students of the use of their devices." So even while they would prefer not to have devices, they didn't want to tell other people that they shouldn't. The only strong and somewhat negative, maybe even obnoxious comments, and by the way, these were all anonymous, so I didn't know who the students were a few students who really wanted to have their devices, and their feeling was that the people who didn't want devices should just grow up. In other words, they were sort of angry. Whereas the people who wanted no devices were trying to be understanding of the people who wanted devices. Some of the people who wanted their devices anticipated what they thought was going to be the response of those who didn't, and basically said, "Well, screw them, because I want, you shouldn't be imposing on us." Now, so I don't know that's not a generalizable result, but what I felt I was doing, and this also potentially relates to your question, was I was giving students the experience, regardless of how they voted, I had another agenda, which was I wanted them to actually experience the different, almost nobody wanted anything goes. They were mainly between limited use of devices and no devices. But it was so, the strong use of devices was so over the top that it was actually, it was not a good learning situation, and basically everybody could see that, right? So what I did was I, in a slightly sneaky way, I was also just getting them to have the experience in the classroom of what those different things actually felt like. So that's potentially another direction to go in, is to actually say, let's all experience what this is like.
Yeah, and then make decisions upon
That's right.
What they think.
Now, I never said to them that I was simply going to go according to how they voted. I'm still the teacher, and I was actually going to make a final decision. And what I chose was the strategy that I have normally used in a required course, which is that I tell them in advance what my preference is. I tell them when they are doing other things, I can see it, even though I won't say anything to them, and that it affects the quality of my attention and affects the quality of my teaching. So I advocate for limited use of devices only being used for the sake of the course, knowing full well that not everybody will do that. One student a couple of years ago came up to me at the end of the course and said to me, I wish that you had banned all devices in the classroom. And I said, why? She said, because since you didn't ban them, I always had my laptop open, and that meant that I couldn't help myself, and I was always doing other things like checking email. So she was saying, help me. I don't have the strength. I don't have the attentional strength. So I wish that you had banned it. So, and by the way, then she ended up taking my course on information and contemplation. So because she wanted to learn more of this.
Well, it's a challenge, but I think rules, strict rules, where you just impose upon the students doesn't really work in the long run. You know, you have to do something else, and I think your approach is really interesting. Could you explain the term the fast world and the slow world as well?
Sure. So I actually borrowed that term from a very well-known journalist in the United States, Thomas Friedman. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He's written several books. He's pretty well known. And it's from one of his earlier books. I can't give you the exact quote. I could send it to you. But he says something like, today there's no longer the first world, the second world, and the third world. There's just the fast world and the slow world. And he, of course, is a very much big believer in the fast world. So he basically says the fast world is the world of innovation, and and that's where we should be. And the slow world are people who just can't keep up any longer and want to hide away, right? And so when I've written about that, I say, well, does it really have to be that everything, that we privilege only the fast, and we don't think that the slow is serious? Aren't there all these things in life that just require time and require us to be slow? Thinking is a slow time activity, and so is the possibility of getting together with your friend or your partner and having long and important conversations, right? I mean, those are slow time activities, right? Whereas other activities are fast time activities. And I quote the Norwegian anthropologist Thomas Eriksson, who talks about fast time and slow time, and how fast time always wins because we're always trying to do the most urgent thing, and so we never have enough time. We can't find the time to do the things like thinking or to have long, intimate relationships and all of that. Well, I believe, I'm somebody who thinks that fast time is a very useful, and the fast world is good and useful, but so is slow time, and so is the slow world. I have spent a lot of time myself in meditation over many decades. I spend weeks at a time going off and doing what the fast world would think of as simply irrelevant. And yet I know for myself, and I'm not suggesting that everybody should want to meditate, but people have so many activities in their lives, like gardening, right? Or craft work, like knitting, or I don't know what the main crafts are in Norway. And on one level, from the point of view of the fast world and innovation, you could say, well, those things are unimportant or irrelevant. But to the person who's doing them, they're part of what it is to be fully alive and a fully human being, right? And in order to maybe to live the fast world and the first fast life, we need to have other activities that make us feel more human, to bring us back into our body and all of that. So the work that I'm doing is really trying to figure out how do we blend the fast and the slow. And the very issue that is central to my work, which is asking people to observe themselves, to be mindful of what's going on in their mind and body when they're doing email, when they're on Facebook or Twitter or anything else like that. From a certain fast world perspective, you could say, well, that's a stupid thing to do. If you're, when you're doing your email, you should just do your email, right? But what I've discovered is that when we observe ourselves, we begin to see some of the very barriers and obstacles that are preventing us from using the tools in the healthy and effective way that we could be. I mean, an example, not even from high tech. We all know the experience of you're trying to read something, right? Whether it's on paper or it's on your Kindle or something, you read something and your attention isn't very strong, and then you start reading the same paragraph over and over again and it's just not sinking in. Well, if you can observe yourself at that point, you could say, oh, look, my attention isn't working, Once you see that, you have a choice. You could say, well, I shouldn't try to read this now. I'm just too tired, or maybe you could even say, well, maybe if I got up and took a break for 5 minutes, then I could come back and do this, or whatever. But instead, very often, my students talk about this all the time. You can be so tired that you're actually not registering anything, but you're still online. You're still, and if you really observed yourself and said, I'm really exhausted, I need to go to bed now. Or I need to do something else, or if I just got up and had a cup of coffee or a glass of water and came back to this, I would do much better. So in fact, being self-observant is one of the fundamental things that human beings are able to do and need to do in order to assess whether or not, it's a form of self-assessment, if you like, to be able to assess, am I actually in a state to learn or to do something that will be effective, or do I need to do something else? Another good example of that, by the way, has to do with the physical body. So many people now have neck problems and carpal tunnel and arm problems and back problems. And some of it comes from the fact that their body is actually telling them that it's hurting. But so many people become really numb. I do this myself too. You get online and you're just powering along and you lose the signals that you should move or that you should do something else. So self-observation is I think, a necessary skill.